We're back with a wonderful guest, Troy Marden. Troy, you are one of the wonderful Southern gardeners from Nashville, Tennessee, and we can't wait to hear all about you. Troy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, Troy, and this is Rich Christakis, and I want to thank you for coming on, and it's an honor to have you here. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, a little about myself. Well, I'm actually a Midwestern boy, a Great Plains boy. Originally, I grew up in a tiny little town in north central Kansas, but I've lived here in Nashville 22 years almost. So I'm sort of adopted Southern, but I
You
love the climate
are.
here.
You are, and you give the best tips ever. Now, you're on a television show there in Nashville, correct?
I am for I guess 12 or 13 years now. I have been one of the co-hosts on a show called Volunteer Gardener, and everybody says why Volunteer Gardener, and it's because Tennessee is the volunteer
Yep.
state.
There you go.
So there,
Now, you came up on a tour earlier this year, and he actually photographed my garden, and we went to Ball Horticultural, and we learned a lot of stuff together. Uh, Tell us why you were up. You're doing a series of books, correct?
well, I've I've done some books of my own. The reason I was up in Chicago was because I was actually doing the photography for a book by an author named Charlie Nardozzi
Mm.
called Foodscaping.
We love
So
Charlie.
Shauna and I spent a bunch of time wandering around Chicago looking at gardens that incorporate food like hers does,
Hmm.
in with flowers and things. Um, I had two books of my own come out this year. Plant This Instead. Well, last year, I guess, back in February of 2014, and then the Southern Gardener's Handbook that came out November 1st. So it's been a busy year.
I'm telling you,
Yeah.
you've been traveling all over, and then when do you find time to do this writing?
Uh, I sneak it in here and there if I can get a block of 3 or 4 hours at a time, and sometimes it's at 4:30 in the morning when I wake up and can't go back to sleep. So,
There you have it. So we want you to give us some spring gardening tips. Do you have some
yeah.
ideas that you can share with the viewers?
Well, if you're like me, I was so busy in the fall that I didn't get all of my fall cleanup done. So I still have a little bit of cleanup to do. But I'm actually kind of glad after last week that I didn't get it all done. I still had some leaves down on the ground protecting things when it dropped from 64 on Sunday to 4 on Wednesday.
Oh,
And
Wow.
yeah, it was as cold here, maybe colder. I think Shauna and I chatted back and forth a little bit on Facebook or somewhere, and she said it was colder here than it was there.
Exactly.
Uh,
wow.
so I was happy to have some protection down still, and I noticed when I went out this morning that some of the hellebores and things are showing some signs of some freeze damage.
Mm.
So um, we'll see what happens when I do uncover things. So I still have some spring cleanup to do, which means getting in and getting the leaves out of the beds and doing some pruning. And after last week's cold snap, I'll have probably more pruning to do. And just getting a fresh coat of mulch down on everything. And I try to do that really early so that when the things do begin coming up in the spring, that they're pushing up through nice, clean mulch and everything looks neat and tidy.
Troy, now, I've got a question for you, and to kind of prep the listeners for the question, I'm gonna ask you about the USDA hardiness zones and what zone that you're gardening in. And USDA hardiness zones are based on the average minimum temperature throughout the year, and you can actually find that online to see what zone you're in. And when you're picking a hardy plant and you're expecting it to come up the next year, you want to make sure that where you live in the country is within that hardiness zone. But so I'm going to guess you're in a zone 7. Am I right?
Well, according to the latest map, yes, we are.
Don't
Zone
believe it.
seven, Zone 7A.
Uh-huh.
And I do believe it, but the problem here is I sort of say that I'm on the borderline of Zone 6B and 7A.
Yeah.
I live high on a ridge. It's really windy. And the problem here in sort of the upper South is that we get really dramatic swings in temperature like we did this last week, where we literally
Mm.
dropped 60 degrees in less than 72 hours.
Wow.
Wow.
Uh, so I think our climate, we don't get cold and stay cold like so many places do. We have this constant freeze and thaw all winter long, and it is really tough on plants.
Hmm.
Yeah, that is extreme, and I know in the Midwest we get some similar swings. So yeah, I know some years that we could get away with some Zone 6 plants up here, even, and and then last year you could hardly get away with a Zone 5 plant.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and my problem is I'm kind of a zone pusher anyway.
Yeah.
So I had lots of zone
You
7.
rebel. You're being a
I,
rebel.
I'm a total rebel. I had lots of zone 7B plants, and I even had some borderline hardy banana trees and things that had
Ooh.
been in the ground for years that I'd never had any trouble with, and I lost all of them. I
Ah,
lost probably a third of my garden last year.
Wow. But that's an opportunity.
It is. It's unfortunate because I sort of get attached to my plants. I collect, and they have meaning to me, and then when I lose them, it's almost like losing a pet.
yeah.
But it's an opportunity to plant things, to dig some new holes and get some things out of the ground that maybe were past their prime, and put those new things in that are sitting in pots. And we all have plants sitting in pots that are waiting for a new home. Even those of us who are quote unquote professionals in the
Mhm.
in the industry, I think we all have a collection of pots waiting to have those plants
Yeah.
find a home.
Sometimes we're like the plumber with who's got leaky faucets at home, but
That's exactly right.
hey, do you have any tips for any of the listeners and viewers who might be a zone pusher on how to do some extra protection to make sure that you've got a better chance? And no guarantees if you're a zone pusher, of course, but what are your tips to help with that?
Well, I tell you, I've got a couple of things. First of all, a heavy coat of mulch if you're on the borderline with some of your plants, a little heavier mulch around them in the wintertime. And I say gardeners a little further north are actually kind of lucky, because as I alluded to a minute ago, one of the problems we have here is that we get so much freeze and thaw. Our
Yep.
ground doesn't, we don't cool down, and the ground freezes and it stays that way. And even for plants that aren't quite as hardy, that's better than freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw,
Hmm.
because that starts breaking roots
It's a
and
hardening off
uh,
process.
hardening off. The other trick that I have learned over the years, I have a garden shed that is not heated. And if it gets really, really cold, like the other night when it got down into the single digits, I went out and I put a tiny little space heater in it just overnight, to keep it from freezing too hard. But I have actually learned to dig small pieces of things that I really want to make sure overwinter. I just basically heal them in and put them in a pot, fill them with a potting mix of some kind, and put them straight into the garden shed late in the fall, usually after a frost. And I have been really successful overwintering, a chunk of a banana that might not be quite
It's a
Ah,
hardy, or a
backup
chunk of
plan.
a banana.
Yeah.
that's a
Uh,
great
That's
idea.
a
And
great
if you're a
idea.
northern gardener, you could do this. You could put it in your basement.
Yeah.
you
You
can put it in
know.
your basement, you can put it in your crawl space.
Hmm.
As long as it doesn't freeze. And my garden shed will get down to 35, 36, 37, but it doesn't freeze hard. I overwinter agapanthus that way here. I overwinter a lot of my more tender cannas, bananas. And that way, if the one in the garden lives over, I still have a great big chunk out there growing the next year. If the one in the garden doesn't live over, then I have a baby, to get going in the spring and put back out.
It
So,
kind of like the Guardians of the Galaxy with Groot. I don't know if you saw that movie,
Groot.
but at
yes.
the end, Groot, they took a cutting off of Groot, and then here he was coming back, and he's dancing,
Yeah.
during the closing credits, and yeah, it's kind of
That's
what
a
it reminded me
new
of.
gardening term. Grooting your plants.
Grooting your plants.
There you go.
Yes. There
Yeah.
you go. We just invented something new today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know what? You can use that anytime you want. I'm all about sharing in this
Great
show.
minds.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, what is your schedule this year? I mean, what is the special thing that you're planting in the spring that you haven't planted before? You have these holes. You're ready to do it, right?
Oh, well, I do. There always are some things that are sitting out there. Now, you guys probably don't grow a Cuba up there in the north, but a Cuba is a really great evergreen with a broad leaf. We grow a lot of it down here in the south, and it's really great for deep shade.
Hmm.
And I've gotten kind of into a kick lately, so I have several of those sitting around. But probably the things that are most desperate for a home, I got into a little bit of daylily breeding a couple of years ago,
Hmm.
and
What's
I
the color that you're shooting for? Because I all the daylily breeders have one special color they really love the most.
well, I'm not so much into one special color. I have gotten into these new modern daylilies that have these really fancy patterns on their
Ah,
faces. So I'm kind of breeding for patterns and fancy faces.
Hmm.
But most importantly, I'm breeding for great garden plants because a lot of the really fancy daylilies today are coming out of Florida and the deep south, and they're not hardy beyond about zone 6B or 7.
Yeah.
And I think a daylily should be hardy to Canada.
Eh,
So,
exactly. It's
you know,
you shouldn't be able to kill a daylily. That's
no,
what I've
a
always.
daylily should not be a connoisseur's. It should be a connoisseur's plant in that it's something new and unusual, and we've taken it to the next level. But it should not be something that is hard to grow. It should not require, special soil and extra mulch and all this fertilizer and water. You should be
hmm
able to plant a daylily in the ground and
and
walk
boom, it
away.
I
works.
think if you can split
hmm
it at any time, and it's the cold hardiness is never an issue, and
It can
Yeah.
survive a nuclear holocaust. I always joke. I've had an old. Remember the old ditch daylilies. That's what we call them, ditch
Yeah.
lilies here.
a tiger lily,
Yeah,
or
just a tiger lily. I had one sat in a bag for 4 months, and I planted it November 1st when the ground was still frozen. It came back huge the next season,
Mhm.
and so I agree with you. I think it should be like that and easy for gardeners. We all need a few plants that are standards that everyone can give it a try and have success with so that the gardeners who are trying and who are new can really try something and know that they're being a good gardener, that it works.
Yeah. Hey
That
Troy.
is so true. And I say that all the time to people when I'm lecturing and things. Yes, I'm a plant collector, but if my garden wasn't full of common plants, then my special ones wouldn't be nearly as special.
That's true. That's true. Hey, kind of circling back, you mentioned that Akuba, and that it sounds like it's a broadleaf evergreen, and I'm not real familiar with it as a northern gardener, but
Yep.
we had a lot of broadleaf evergreen and needle evergreen dieback and death, specifically boxwoods, hollies, those kind of plants last year. Some of the broadleaf evergreen, even some of the rhododendrons took some damage. It was that bad of a year. But do you have any tips for the evergreen gardener, or somebody that's trying to protect those plants throughout the winter time when you get these extreme cold and then the wind? Anything that can help the listeners and viewers with that?
Well, really, if you're up further north or out on the Great Plains, in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma area, sort of where I grew up, we basically didn't grow broadleaf evergreens where I grew up because the wind was so bad.
Hmm.
And what a lot of people don't understand is it's not really the cold that kills them. What happens in those areas where you have frozen ground and wind, the wind draws the water out of the leaves, but the roots are frozen and can't take any more water up. So the wind really just freeze dries the plant. If your plants are small enough, one thing that you can do is drive some stakes in the ground, wrap some burlap around those. Use some really dry, loose straw, anything that will protect. And it's really not, again, about protecting against the cold. A lot of those plants are perfectly hardy to zone 5. It's the wind in the
Hmm.
wintertime
Mm.
when the ground is frozen and you're getting that desiccation, the evaporation of water from the leaves, but the roots are frozen and the plant can't draw more water up. That's when you run into trouble. So
What do you
anything that you can do to provide a wind barrier is really important for broadleaf evergreens
What do you
in
think
cold
about
climates.
what do you think about anti-desiccants such as like a wilt stop or a wilt proof? I know a lot of times it's derived from pine sap. What do you think about using those products?
I think they're great. We use them here. And again, it's because for us, we have so much freezing and thawing that goes on. I particularly use them on newly planted broadleaf evergreens. Of course, down here in the South, we're growing a lot of southern magnolia. We're
Hmm.
growing a lot of rhododendron, a lot of evergreen azalea. A little further south, even camellias. And when they're newly planted, especially, and they don't have those roots established yet, we use a lot of wilt stopper kind of products, wilt proof, anti-desiccation kind of products to help our broadleaf evergreens make it through those first winters. And further north, I would call it an every winter thing
Yes.
to help, you know, with all of
Yes.
that.
Yeah,
So
we try to educate the consumer that you should buy your wilt stop by Halloween just to have it on hand because it'll actually sell out. You get all of a sudden that cold snap comes and people rush and clear the shelf.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
So that's a good tip. All right, well, Shauna,
I have more questions. Can I
yes,
ask more questions?
she's been
Because
itching to get in. I
I've
keep
been
just
jumping.
getting
I
in
want to
there.
knock him
Wait,
down and jump into the conversation. I'm curious. Your containers are absolutely magnificent. I've seen photos that you've taken over the years of some of the container designs that you do. And I'm wondering for the early spring gardener, what do you recommend that you put in a container that's beautiful and creative?
well, for the early spring folks, I still think you're looking at a lot of foliage at that time of year, and that's a good thing. I like foliage. I like leaves. I like texture. Um, my rule for my garden as well as my container is containers are that you have to look as good in leaf as you do in bloom.
Oh, good
Uh,
tip.
because a lot of times now in containers, most of the time, or at least part of the time, we're talking about annuals. So you get more flower power out of those annuals, or maybe you're using a shrub or a few perennials. But the rule of thumb for me is you have to look as good in leaf as you do in bloom, because if you stop blooming, I still want you to be pretty. So I think in early spring, the things that I'm looking at are things like coral bells, who are flushing that new foliage that is so beautiful in the
Hmm.
early spring months. And most of them are just stone cold hardy. So you can even leave them in your pots a lot of times. At least we can. A little further when you really get far north, maybe not so much, but um, I use them as winter plants, even the coral bells, the heucheras.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
glad you brought that up
I
because a lot of people just think of that as in up here as putting that in the ground because it's a perennial, but it's a great foliage plant for container.
Hmm.
It's a great foliage plant for containers. Let's see. I use shrubs. I use red twig dogwood in my containers, yellow twig dogwood in my containers. And then, for us, because I'm a little further south, because I'm a zone 6B, sort of 7A gardener, we actually can do bulbs in pots. Now, for gardeners a little further north, I might think about looking at purchasing a few forced bulbs, or maybe forcing some of my own bulbs in cold frames and then dropping those into my mixed containers in the spring to bring the bulb display up out of the ground and into containers
Yeah.
along the
You
way.
could even toss in an amaryllis. Yeah, I've
You could
done
toss
that.
in amaryllis,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
don't forget about cool dwarf conifers. I don't think you can go wrong
Absolutely.
again through the winter months and into the early spring with the dwarf conifers, because they have so much color, they have so many different forms and foliage types. They're just really an interesting bunch of plants.
Okay, Troy, we're going to have to wrap it up. But before we go, we want to
Sure.
thank you for coming on. And if you could tell the listeners and viewers what your website where people can maybe view your show and then the books you've written where they can possibly buy them online.
Well, of course, you can find the books at Amazon. And again, the first one was called Plant This Instead. The second one is called The Southern Gardener's Handbook. Our television show is Volunteer Gardener, which you can find at volunteergardener.org. Um, and you can also find us on YouTube. If you search Volunteer Gardener, we have our own YouTube channel, so you can find us there.
Awesome. I'm going to look you up and I'm going to watch you in all my spare
All
moments.
right.
All right.
So
Thanks
good to
again,
talk to
Troy.
you guys.
Oh, thanks so much. And you
Thank
have
you.
a great spring.
All right.
Okay.
Take care.
We'll be back with our next segment in just a few moments.
Feeding your lawn every year and still not satisfied? That's because you're doing half the job. You must feed your soil too with Jonathan Green's new American Lawn Plan. Your soil is filled with nutrients, but many never reach the grass because your soil biology hasn't been activated. This includes nutrients from your lawn fertilizer too. Jonathan Green's new American Lawn Plan corrects the problem with 2 soil reviving fertilizers: Love Your Lawn, Love Your Soil and Magical. Love Your Lawn, Love Your Soil has a special organic formula that activates soil biology, releasing trapped nutrients while loosening up soil for deeper root growth. Magical balances soil pH so nutrients from lawn fertilizers don't go to waste and weeds don't become a problem. Do the whole job. Feed your lawn and your soil with Jonathan Green's New American Lawn and get the great lawn you've always wanted. Visit newamericanlawn.com to find your local Jonathan Green retailer. That's newamericanlawn.com.